where your partisan politics lies is geography. And there's a statistic that was done several years ago, or a poll done by Gallup that asked self-described Democrats, independents, and Republicans to give their preference as to where they would want to live, either in a large house with more space and an open area that was further from other houses, or in a smaller house that was closer to other houses and that had public transportation and was closer to services, et cetera, et cetera. The independents were divided 50-50. 50% of them wanted a large house with more space. 50% of them wanted a smaller house closer together. But the stark divide between self-identified Democrats and self-identified conservatives was very, very large. Over 85% for both groups said that I would rather live in a large house with more space, and progressive liberals, I would rather live in a smaller house closer together. That is a very important statistic and a meaningful one, because it suggests that our polarization, and all the studies on polarization suggest this is the case. Our polarization is cultural and it's social, and we need to understand it through things like group theory. So increasingly, liberals and conservatives are not living in the same neighborhoods. Even in purple states have red areas and blue areas. Even in suburban areas, I looked at recently in detail voting patterns and demographic and partisan polarization in Cincinnati, Ohio. And some suburbs are solidly conservative and other suburbs are not, and are much more democratic. So we're living very separate kinds of lives, and we're increasingly seeing a future in which it is not all of us together. And this is really the polarization that affects our American politics today. In other words, it's not issue polarization. And this is something to keep in mind as I go a little bit further down the line. We are not actually nearly as polarized on the issues as some of you may think. Issues do not polarize us the way that culture does. And I think there is some hope for the Democratic Party in rural America, focusing on the right issues, understanding what issue ownership is, and conveying those and articulating those issues can be a path to success. The suburban shift suggests the likelihood of Democratic national majorities. As we saw in the 2020 election, millions more votes for Joe Biden than there was for Donald Trump, even though the Electoral College conveyed a closer result than the popular vote does. But the overall popular national vote, this country is trending a lot more Democratic and progressive. But we've got three overlapping majoritarianisms in this country. We have the majoritarianism of the district level House races. I'm talking about the federal government only. I'm not talking about federalism, state and local. So you have district level House races, which can benefit Republicans and conservatives in a lot of ways, even if they don't have the total number of votes that Democrats do in a state. Now, I sometimes take a mythical state when I teach political science, and I'll draw it on the board, and I'll draw the districts, and I'll show that, through packing and cracking, which are two strategies of gerrymandering, you can pack in a lot of liberal votes into a smaller area and give that one district to the Democrats, and Republicans can take 2 or 3 districts that through cracking liberal areas or packing them in, one of the two. And although the gerrymandering game has been played by both sides of the political line throughout American political history, Republicans have a much more vested interest in it and are frankly much more successful strategically in gerrymandering various different states at the district level. You also have the Senate, which of course 2 senators per state, no matter how populous that state is. That is a clear advantage for rural America in terms of influence on federal government and representation. Studies suggest that the average voter from Wyoming has around 100 times more weight in their vote than the average voter in California because of both the Senate and the Electoral College, which is the third majoritarianism, the Electoral College, which through the state filter and the selection of the president gives rural America and rural states a decided advantage relative to a popular vote. How do Democrats take those kinds of decided rural American advantages in politics and turn them toward issues that we care about, or toward a party that we believe is going to be better at solving the kinds of problems that we identify. That's really hard to do, but is the conversation at hand. And I hope that I can give some ideas about this. With the growing suburban shift, and with urban and suburban America living culturally, in some ways, very different lives than rural America, we have a growing resentment that I want to talk about. And again, this is more of the diagnoses stage, a growing resentment in rural America. And there are lots of different kinds of resentments that are going on. First of all, class matters a great deal. Economics matter a great deal. It has long been held that wealthier Americans are likely to vote, more likely to vote, and they're more likely to vote Republican. Trump in 2016, Trump in 2020 had a large share of those votes from high-income voters. There wasn't a huge shift, dramatic shift. Lots of high-income voters still went and reliably voted Republican. But we have this Trump voter stereotype out there, which is that the average Trump voter is poor, white, rural, and male. And these overlapping grievances, that cultural grievances of being poor, racial grievances of whiteness, or geographic grievances of isolation, and grievances of masculinity, that are the stereotype. Now, this is a common thing that we see, but we have to keep in mind that Trump had quite a bit of diversity in his voting bloc, with some 75 million voters. We saw this. I can throw out lots of different examples, like Cuban and Puerto Rican voters in Florida, up the interstate that connects Miami to Orlando, went heavier for Trump in 2020 than they did in 2016. Trump closed the gap significantly in Miami-Dade County, which is why Trump won Florida relatively easily in this past November. So Trump has some diversity. It's not as much diversity as the Democratic Party. Nationally, of course, Democratic Party is a lot more diverse ideologically, is a lot more diverse in its voting bloc, et cetera, et cetera. But we shouldn't simply cast all Trump voters in this way, that they look exactly the same, of all of the images that we get from the media. And let's talk about those voters, though, those specific voters that are poor, that are white, and that are rural, those from middle America. These Trump voters in particular, studies suggest that these voters, this particular demographic, tends to see him as an economic populist. And they tend to bring some of their economic grievances to bear in voting for Trump. Now, whether or not Trump actually solves any of those eroding economic foundations of middle America and of working class America is obviously a different discussion entirely. And if you want my opinion, it's no surprise he did nothing to help those particular voters. But the perception is that in Trump casting himself as a cultural populist against elites, both political elites and cultural elites, that in some ways he's on their side. And what is going on here is that, as I will point out here in a couple of slides a little bit later, because I want to get down to the nitty gritty in this thing, is that so many Trump voters are mistaking their real and apparent and impactful economic grievances and translating them into cultural grievances far too often. And I think one of the deeper strategies that's going to be hard to do is to dislocate those things and to isolate the economic issues that are affecting working class Americans, and to somehow insulate them from all of these other cultural grievances that are mere distractions, right? As wage stagnation continues in this country, we've got, what about windmills? What about Starbucks coffee cups? What about what's happening at the border? These are political distractions that keep working class Americans from focusing on and identifying the core economic issues that can really impact their lives at the voting booth and in government. There was a voter study, an organization called Voter Study Group, and you can look it up, voterstudygroup.org. And this study showed that among Republicans making $40,000 or less, there was a majority support for an increase in minimum wage. There were even higher majorities for paid family leave, for subsidized daycare of one kind or another, for higher taxes on the wealthy. These are issues that have a majority of support for Republican voters that are working class and poor. So in other words, this isn't really about the issues. And there's an opening here in terms of economic justice and reframing some of core elements of the Democratic Party toward issues of economic justice are going to be very important going forward. And that can't happen at the local level only. It's got to happen at the national level. It's got to happen at the DNC level. The Democratic Party has got to change its relationship to labor, to working poor, to economic issues. And how they do so is going to matter a great deal for what we're going to see in terms of party politics in the future. So the big takeaway here is if the Dems grow in rural America, economic issues have to be in focus. They've got to absolutely be in focus. We've got to think about economic justice and what that means. And while issues of minimum wage increase and paid family leave or higher taxes on the wealthy are crucial ones that there's support for, the Democratic Party in rural America also has to focus on small businesses and entrepreneurs. And what can we do for small businesses? What can we do for in terms of agriculture policy and agricultural issues that is the economic foundation of so much of rural America? How can the Democratic Party speak to those issues and provide actual policy solutions that are going to be attractive? I have to talk about neoliberalism, and it's nobody, and I'm gonna. This is a word that's thrown around quite a bit and is often very confused, I believe. And it becomes too much of an umbrella term, but it is our political order of our era, ever since the early 1980s and the Reagan movement up until now. We have lived in a particular political order which has eroded working class American and brought about a whole bunch of economic injustices that both parties are still searching for how to articulate and deal with. I want to define neoliberalism in a very precise way to say that neoliberalism are a set of policies orientated around austerity programs, which are cutting social services, around deregulation of industries, global free trade, a commitment to global free trade, and then finally the financialization of global capitalism. So capitalism has shifted a great deal toward financialization and financial speculation. It's not just Wall Street, but other speculatory institutions throughout the global world. Most of our money and the vast majority of our money is liquid. The passive investment the return on passive investments, that is just, having money that you put into a stock market or whatever, the capital gains that come from that is actually larger in this country than the GDP per capita. And the GDP per capita is basically just all of our wages, all Americans' wages that they make, that they get on a Friday or at the end of the month, et cetera, et cetera. There is more money returned on capital gains in this country made than there is in all the paychecks. And that's what I mean by the financialization of our capitalism. So we have more and more liquid, speculative, unrestrained and unregulated growth, economic growth at the top ends of our system. And that was one of the biggest drivers of economic inequality, okay? Economic inequality is at historic levels, and a lot of it has to do with this financialization. Wall Street and all these other speculatory financial institutions out there, I mean, it's like a big giant spigot and money's just pouring out of it. And there's ungodly sums of money to be made in this particular kind of global capitalism that we live in. So that's neoliberalism. It's both at home and abroad, though. And the abroad is called the Washington Consensus. And the Washington Consensus is that through the IMF, through the World Bank, through Washington, through the EU, there is an agreement that we open up the trade barriers of developing countries and underdeveloped countries and chase low wages there, with an agreement, a contract in hand, which says that those countries need to develop austerity programs. They need to cut their social services. They need to deregulate their industries. They need to commit to global free trade and eliminate all tariffs. And then multinational corporations will go in, chase the bottom dollar of low wages. This is not just China anymore, of course. They're actually moving out of China because China's growing a middle class, and they're looking for new horizons of the lowest common denominator. It's a race to the bottom. It makes a lot of money at the top, but it's a race to the bottom for most of us. So that's neoliberalism. Now, Republicans, of course, have been faithful stewards of this stuff. We often call this trickle down or Reaganomics or whatever. But Democrats, Clinton and Obama, have done little to provide alternative course. Now, for Bill Clinton in the 1990s, we've only had 2 Democratic presidents in between Reagan and Trump, Clinton and Obama. Clinton was much more, had much more obstacles in his way, and really could do very little to substantially deal with the neoliberal political order in his time. And in fact, his strategy was exactly the opposite. It was called, what was that strategy called? Oh, I forget the name of it, but triangulation, where he would take Republican issues and sort of, I want to end welfare as we know it, right? And the Democratic Party was against cash payments to Americans because it was welfare, and welfare had become a dirty word, despite the fact that Lyndon Baines Johnson administration used the word welfare because it's in the Constitution. I always ask my students, is the word welfare in the Constitution? They almost all say no, but it's in there. It's shows up twice, and that was the reason why that word was chosen for those social policies and programs. Nevertheless, Clinton was unable to really deal with this. Obama had an opportunity and a chance because Obama came in during the Great Recession and came in with this notion of too big to fail, and the mass stimulus that was given to the financial institutions that were crumbling before our eyes held up the neoliberal order. And so Obama, arguably, if I were a historian writing about the neoliberal order, I would say that Obama is one of the most important saviors of neoliberalism, because without Obama's massive stimulus to the financial institutions, neoliberalism would have been in much more shaky ground through the Obama administration. So I'm not saying that path would have been easy. It would have been filled with political peril, but Obama could have taken the country in a very different direction and said, you know what, some of these institutions do need to fail, and we're going to provide stimulus, but it's going to be directly to Americans. He could have much more substantially attacked this neoliberal political order. We've had 40 years for this thing to bear fruit, and there's little evidence of lifting any boats of this, what we call the trickle down or Reaganomics. And I know I'm not saying anything new to most of you folks out there, but we've had massive, a really, really long period of time of wage stagnation. From 1980 to 2017, the median wage of a full-time white male worker in 1979, I believe it was $44,000 a year. And the same full-time white male worker median wage in the year 2016 was like $45,500. And so adjusted for inflation, they've lost money and gone down. We've also had a decline of manufacturing, which has affected middle America a great deal and turned middle America away from the coastal elites, the cultural elites, the political elites on both the East and the West Coast, and a kind of rising grievance that has come out of it. And that's the result. Growing economic grievance, particularly in middle America, particularly among white men, grievances that are then redirected toward cultural and political elites. Now, this is a very famous internet meme, and I know that some of you might not like it, but it's because he's a Cardinals fan. That's why he's doing that. So cultural and economic, we've got overlapping resentments that have been boiling in our political culture and that have just exploded open in the era of Trump. And in fact, Trump really rose on the whole idea of these resentments finding a voice in politics and finding a voice through someone like Donald Trump, who, of course, it doesn't matter if you're a Trump supporter or if you don't like Trump at all, we all can agree that the politics of anger and the politics of resentment and the politics of hate are absolutely core to Donald Trump's appeal. They are absolutely core. I hear this from Trump supporters. Trump supporters are like, yeah, right, he's angry, and he has every right to be, because I'm angry, and he's channeling my rage and anger and my resentment. And he did so very, very successfully. So white grievance, the idea that an increasingly aware not just increasingly diverse and multicultural world, but in America increasingly aware of its racist past and history, and of the present challenges of what Michelle Alexander will call the new Jim Crow, of the incarcereal state as a form of institutionalized racial Jim Crow. Increasing awareness of this has come with resentments of whiteness in our world today. Masculine grievances. The men's rights movement has been growing over the past 20 years, and we've seen some really explosive forms of misogyny in our culture. And I'm talking about the growth of what these group called the incelibates, or the incel world of male grievance. And we've seen mass shootings that have been directly associated with this. And this is a real cultural problem. And we're losing young men in this, as this is not just middle-aged, and older. We're losing young men to this toxic, misogynistic world of hate. Class grievance. And what I mean by class grievance is grievance of working class America and feeling as though they're left behind. This is part of a kind of cultural isolation. To be poor and white and from middle America is pretty much the bottom of the barrel in America today. And this is the first time in history. I think Dr. McClure spoke to you, and part of what Dr. Dan McClure, historian at Fort Hays State University, researches and talks about is how we're in a very recent historical moment in which, for the first time, white males are not just inherently at the top of the pecking order just by being white and by being male. And so there is so much grievance associated with this, and resentment associated with this. And if you're poor and Black, you still have an identity of Blackness that provides some sense of community. And there seems to be community everywhere except in poor white middle America, where you are looked down upon by everyone. How many Hollywood movies are about poor whites in middle America? How much of our cultural expressions are about this? Very, very little, very few. It's the forgotten group in many ways, and they certainly feel it. This is where this resentment comes from. So the political right will often respond, another factor here, political right will often respond to growing identity politics on the left, awareness that our identities are so often the source and site of politics itself. LGBTQ, gender justice, as I mentioned, racial justice. And the right has developed a strategy over the past 20 years or so to play identity politics on the right. And this looks something like, well, why can't I be proud of being white? Or men being discriminated for being men with regards to issues of maybe child custody or the courts or whatever. You see this stuff percolating all over the internet, and it's talked about with increasing fervor. And these are the kinds of things that Donald Trump, again, rose on in terms of his political power. When we could say populism, what we're talking about is a political phenomenon that shapes an us versus them. So there is a group of us and there are others out there. And the degree to which you create the others as elites, whatever elite means, and the us as everyone else, you've got the recipe for political populism. Now, populism can be on the left, it can be on the right, and it can even be in the center sometimes. But right-wing populism or Trump populism today, it takes those economic declines that are real, the economic dislocations that are real, that I talked about with regards to neoliberalism, right? Taking that economic erosion and then translating it into cultural, racial, and political grievance, okay? So the elites in Trumpian right-wing populism are not the economic elites. They're political elites, the swamp. They're cultural elites, Hollywood, whatever, in terms of like cultural elites that live on that live on the coasts of America. And they're crucially not the economic elites. And this is obviously, there are lots of substantial differences between Bernie Sanders left populism and Trump right-wing populism, but this is a key one where the populists of the progressive left identify economic elites as the main enemy in the us versus them equation, whereas the Trumpian right, it's all about those cultural and political elites. It's the swamp people and it's the cultural elites that are behind them, be it in the media or in the entertainment world or wherever they can be found. I mentioned a couple of books that if you're interested in this, White Lash, Unmasking White Grievance at the Ballot Box, pretty good book by Terry Smith. I think an even better book if you were interested in this one, I believe it, pretty sure is at the Hayes Public Library. I saw it there on the shelf. Dying of Whiteness, How the Politics of Racial Resentment is Killing America's Heartland. I find that to be a really touching and very interesting book that finds the connection between racial politics and economic politics, and makes the case that this white grievance is affecting them economic. It's exacerbating the economic erosions that are taking place in rural America and small town America. Okay, one more about diagnoses, and this is party imperatives, things that are happening in the party. Now, I come at this from a couple of different directions. There was a good Politico article about a rural county in Wisconsin that had drummed up a lot of support. A lot of people came off the sidelines and joined the Democratic Party and mobilized. And after the 2016 presidential election, and they got a lot of support, and they made a lot of connections, and they got a lot of interested people. And Trump won that county by more votes than he did in 2020. And the reason why, on the ground, and we've seen this throughout rural America and through small town America, is that it's part of the blame has to lie at the feet of the DNC. The National Democratic Party has been a problem. They have left behind rural America and working class America far too substantially, and could have made and should have made a better effort in our recent past of supporting the Democratic Party and liberal causes in rural America and small town America. So, but there are other imperatives to the party. The party has moved since Obama in particular. The Democratic Party has orientated around a kind of nationalizing technocratic electoral strategy. So what I mean by that is the national party means everything, and all issues are nationalized that the DNC focuses on. What I mean by technocratic are policy elites and policy wonks that form together really kind of complicated patchwork, quiltwork policies. I called a lot of Obama era policies Neo-New Deal in this way, because FDR's New Deal historically was about bringing together all these diverse stakeholders and creating big policy that gave everybody a little slice of the pie. And there are some benefits to that, but there are some downsides to that. And the Affordable Care Act is a really good example of this. The Affordable Care Act is now much more popular than it was when it first came out. And one of the reasons why is because the Democratic Party had a very difficult time articulating what the Affordable Care Act was doing and how it was going to work. And part of the reason why they had a difficult time articulating how it was going to work is because it's complicated. It's a very complicated policy, the Affordable Care Act. The linchpin in the middle is that the mandate, health insurance mandate, everyone has to have health insurance. That's going to create a larger pool. That's going to bring down costs. And then you'll have a list of essentials that all private insurance companies will have to provide, even in their most basic and cheapest plan. And there's lots of ins and outs. That's just the most basic way of describing the Affordable Care Act. It's complicated, and it was hard to solve, and it's very technocratic in that way. So the question that's often asked in political science is, why is the white working class leaving the Democratic Party? You may have heard that question before, but we need to reorder that question. Why has the Democratic Party left the white working class? That's the real question, because the Democratic Party has abandoned the labor and working class issues pretty substantially over the past. Now, is there hope with a new Biden administration? Potentially. We have, for example, in the Department of Labor, a real union activist for the first time in like 40 years, a gentleman named Walsh from Massachusetts, who was a party organizer and a union regular. That's unusual, even for a Democrat to put in the Department of Labor a union activist. So, there's lots of time for the Biden administration and for the Democratic Party in this time to reorientate their strategy and to look more at and invest more in competitive races throughout the country, et cetera, et cetera. We'll see where this goes. But the past 20 years has not been good in terms of the National Democratic Party recognizing the need to be a viable political party in all 50 states, in not just on the coast, but in the middle, and in all counties, to have a viable Democratic Party. So, we've got a two-party system because we have a majoritarian system of government, but there's no room for a Labor Party. I always teach this to my students in classes that with a proportional representation in a multi-party system, almost every country has a labor party. But in American political history, arguably, we've only had two moments where we had a kind of true labor party. And that was probably the 1930s and the New Deal era Democratic Party, and frankly, the Jacksonian Democratic Party in the 19th century. But that was obviously deeply problematic in terms of the issues of race and slavery and indigenous genocide and a whole bunch of other things. So we've rarely had a true labor party in this country. And there might be an opportunity here for rural Dems. I come from Minnesota, and in Minnesota, the Democratic Party is not called the Democratic Party. It's called the Democratic Farmer Labor Party, the DFL. That's the name of the Democratic Party in Minnesota. And maybe there's an opportunity here for rural Dems to revision a party, a nominal party under the umbrella of the national organization of the Democratic Party. That's called Farmer Labor or Families Farmer Labor Party. Something that can reorientate and focus these core issues that are issues of which rural Americans can, even if they're not liberal progressives or Democrats, they can find something of the problems identified and the solutions provided that appeal to them. The upshot here is that the Democratic Party is, as I mentioned, more ideologically diverse. So you have a lot more moderates in the Democratic Party than you do in the Republican Party. The Republican Party, they're loyal foot soldiers, and they fall in line in Washington and in state capitals as well. And there tends to be a very much more ideological homogeneity in the Republican Party, but there's much more diversity in the Democratic Party. And the national leadership has generally followed the strategy and pursued the strategy to allow Dem candidates in local elections to run races they need to in order to be competitive. So there are very few issues that are sort of no-go issues for the National Democratic Party in terms of candidates running at a local or state level. You have pro-life Democratic candidates, for example, or you have strong Second Amendment Democratic candidates as another example, and in ways that are very hard to do in the Republican Party. So there is some upshot to that. There's flexibility here. And within that flexibility, I think it's not just about having pro-life candidates or pro-Second Amendment candidates, but creating policy innovation and being creative about identifying social problems and solutions that can actually benefit rural America and small town America, okay? So there's a book out there by Jane Cleave. Some of you may have read this book already. She might be a person to reach out to see if she could do a Zoom chat with you as well and talk about some of these. I'm going to pull some of her ideas from this book, Harvest the Vote, How Democrats Can Win Again in Rural America. So a couple of different points that I want to make. First of all, issue ownership is a concept in political science where one party does better on the issue because of the perception in the public that that party is more responsive and has better policies, et cetera, et cetera. Now, sometimes it's just a perception, sometimes it's genuine substance to it. But the Democrats do better on some issues and Republicans do better on other issues. For example, and this comes down to rhetoric and just words. So, for example, when the word taxes is used, generally it favors Republicans. When the word education is mentioned, it generally favors Democrats. So, of course, I'm sure most of you all know this, it's important to identify those issues that the party is strongest on. So the issues of economic fairness and economic justice, healthcare, families, education, and the environment are core issue ownership areas that are conversations, when conversations have to be made in terms of Democratic Party outreach in rural America, focusing on these issues is really absolutely crucial. Another component to this, I noticed this when Representative Hsu came on and to the pavilion in downtown Hayes. I would love to see more younger folks at events like that. And I think part of that is intergenerational outreach and communication. We've got to reach out to younger folks in this area. And if only to provide some sense of hope for young folks who increasingly feel as though they don't want to live in rural Kansas. And we're losing demographically, a lot of younger people who don't see much of a future here. If they saw opportunities to run for local office, saw opportunities to connect to the Democratic Party, it would at least facilitate and make easier a kind of a positive community experience for young people that they can point to and say, you know what, living out here is not so bad. For at least I have a community of individuals. I know that there's a community out here that think similarly about the world that I do. Engaging younger residents is absolutely crucial. What Trina had talked about, and it's great that there are programs associated with this. It is really absolutely vital that the Democratic Party fields candidates for all offices. And you've got to get the Democratic Party name attached to candidates, and you've got to get those candidates to run for office. Winning is great, but you can't even begin the process of winning unless you have candidates. And so candidates have to be fielded. And this studies in political science have shown that parties do better and grow membership and grow awareness just by fielding candidates. So having candidates out there is really crucial. Lastly, I teach American Government, which is a 100-level general education course of students who are not political science majors. And one of the first questions I ask them is why we have government. And the reason why I ask the question why we have government is because I am shocked at the number of people who don't actually know how to answer this question. This is a really simple and basic question, but I think most of the public, I imagine most of the public struggles to identify why on earth do we have government to begin with. So having a conversation about the core issue of what politics is all about and what government is all about are social problems, public problems, shared problems. That's why we have government. Government is not all of our problems are public problems. And in fact, and this is I think a good strategy for communicating politically and talking politics with others, is to have a conversation about where is the line between a public problem and a private problem? How do we identify? How do we go about, because a discussion can be had on issues as to whether or not they are indeed public problems for which institutions of government are supposed to solve. That's why we have government, is to provide public solutions to public problems. But what's a public problem? What's a private problem? I'll give you an example, abortion, right? Abortion. Conservatives believe that abortion is a public problem and requires a government solution. Many liberal progressives are pro-choice and for a woman's right to choose, and believe that abortion is a private problem, a problem that is discussed between a woman and their doctor, right? And so having a conversation about public and private problems is really a crucial place to begin. And I think having this conversation in such a way, as one of the points that Clede points out in this book, Harvest the Vote, is don't be afraid to have conversations with conservatives in rural America about politics, and don't be afraid to recognize that there are going to be disagreements. And to say, yeah, we just disagree on that issue, and that's okay. But to consistently focus back in on what are public problems that we both agree are public problems, and now we can talk about some solutions to those public problems. That, I think, is a really crucial way of opening up a conversation to others. And core to this book, Harvest the Vote, is that communication is everything. You've got to get interpersonal, and you've got to reach out. Do I think that the coronavirus pandemic affected the votes in the 2020 November election? You bet. And I think that they affected negatively the Democratic Party. And I think that that was a surprise for a lot of people, because they saw the sheer incompetence of the Trump administration's handling of the coronavirus pandemic as a kind of political gift and a political win. Whereas many of the conservatives down the line, somewhat to some varying degree, parroted Trump's incompetence with regards to the coronavirus pandemic. But one thing that affected the Democrats substantially is that Democratic outreach is absolutely vital and crucial. And too many Democrats, for good reasons, stayed home because they wanted to protect their communities and their families. But knocking on doors and reaching out to people and shaking people's hands and being there in person is absolutely vital to politics. Every meaningful study on this shows that phone calls don't do anything. They don't work. Having phone banks, calling people up, and doing campaign outreach through phones shows almost no effect on whether or not a candidate wins an election. But knocking on doors does have an effect. Knocking on doors, having events, having people come out to those events, meeting people. And I think this is one of the reasons why the Republicans actually did very well in the November 2020 election. Trump may have lost, but the Democrats chopped into the House lead. And if not for the special election race in Georgia, which you can lay entirely on the feet of Donald Trump. Trump completely messed up Georgia for the Republicans and handed the Democrats 2 Senate seats in Georgia. Then Republicans would have looked quite strong in the Senate races in November 2020 as well. And so I think there's a factor there, and that's a lesson. And it's not to say that we should have coronavirus be damned, knocked on people's doors and had events. What I'm saying is that looking toward the future, it is absolutely crucial that in-person events and contact amongst the community and getting out there and meeting people and having conversations in public settings is really crucial to growing the Democratic Party in Ellis County. I'm not going to talk about this. I'm going to leave this aside. But I do. I'll say one very quick thing about this. Did anyone see this mayor from Colorado City, Texas, Tim Boyd, when the Texas utilities, the electricity and gas and water, the crisis that came out of that cold snap that they had in Texas? This mayor from Colorado City wrote this on social media, which is like basically this kind of conservative idea that government is always the problem, never the solution. This anti-government kind of toxic on steroids thing. I mean, this guy literally during this tragedy is writing this social media post saying, look, the city doesn't owe you anything. You're on your own. Go find fresh water on your own. Look out for your own family. It's every person for themselves. This is where the Republican Party has gone. They have lost their minds with regards to, and they've lost all, I think, semblance of what public service really is all about and public solutions. Now, this is an extreme example, but I think I had a conversation in my class about this mayor, Tim Boyd. He later resigned from the outrage of this. But I had a conversation in my class where we discussed, why did he write this? I think my viewpoint is that he really, like so many other local public elected officials, really go in not having any idea about what government is all about, what public service is all about. He just doesn't know. It's ignorance to some degree. And I think that this is unfortunate for our communities and for America politically, generally speaking, but it also, I think rural Dems need to find some opportunity in this, at least in finding ways to articulate and offer an escape route, if you will, for this increasingly bankrupt ideology of just distrust in all forms of authority, distrust in government, distrust in science, distrust in objective news information. It's a full-blown ideology of mistrust in authority, and rural Democratic Party need to find ways to provide some kind of out, some kind of alternative route, some kind of escape route from folks who are increasingly worried about this and seeing problems in this.